think that's leveling out. So, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Score Concordance webinar. We'll be looking at exploring this particular study that was published last week, establishing score concordance between the enhanced PT academic and IELTS academic. I am Sarah Hughes. I'm the Director of Assessment Research and Validity for PTE, and I'm also one of the authors of the study. So we'll take a look at the study today in a bit of detail. We can answer some questions that people have and hopefully discuss sort of what this all means for people, particularly institutions looking to set score requirements. Just before we start, I'll say this has been a large undertaking, a score concordance of PT academic and IELTS academic. So even though sort of I'm one of the authors on the study, this actually reflects the work of a huge amount of people across Pearson, a lot of different teams, a lot of time and effort and investment to do this kind of score concordance study. So it's wonderful to be able to talk about it and engage with people and their questions about it now, and great to have it out in the world. So the agenda for today, I've organized it around 4 questions. So we'll talk about what score concordance is, why it matters now, why it's important. I think people have different levels of familiarity with score concordance, so I think it's good to start with a baseline of what we're doing. We'll look at how the study was conducted, the different steps that we went through, the criteria we were trying to meet when designing the study. And we'll also take a look at sort of what are the findings here and how do they compare to previous studies that we've conducted, previous concordance studies between PT academic and IELTS academic. And then really we'll talk about what does this all mean for institutions and score requirements, and how we go about thinking about how to set them now. So starting off with what is score concordance? Why is it important? So the aim of a score concordance study is to try to find equivalent scores between 2 different tests. And that might sound like a contradiction in terms. So you're looking for equivalent scores across 2 tests that are essentially different in some way. So we try to get as close as we can to what we think of as an equivalent score, but it's never a precise sort of alignment between them at the end of the day. We do this by having the same group of people take both tests, and then we compare their scores on the 2 tests. And why does this matter? It's largely because some entry requirements are based on concordance. And this is because institutions, governments, other score users are often operating in this space where there are multiple tests. So they're accepting multiple tests as evidence of English language proficiency and really need a fair way to compare scores across these different tests. And more score concordance is becoming the answer to that question, right? It's becoming the main tool that people use to try to set these fair or comparable standards across different tests. And we've seen this huge increase in discussion of concordance. Part of that's because multiple testing organizations have released new concordance studies in the last 6 months or so. And there's this increasing emphasis on using score concordance as a way to understand the meaning of test scores, which is actually a really interesting concept. So what does a PTE score mean in terms of IELTS or vice versa? There's actually a lot of different ways to understand the meaning of test scores. Concordance is just sort of one part of that. But I think it's a part that's sort of growing in exposure and knowledge in the general public. So it's becoming a more prominent part of the conversation. Before we jump into the study itself, I just wanted to touch on a couple other ways of understanding the meaning of test scores. And in particular, we have concordance, but we also have alignments. There's some other ways that we can talk about the meaning of test scores, but these 2 often come up together. And I think they're often not as well understood, particularly how they're different and what they're actually doing differently. So concordance is about trying to identify these equivalent score points on 2 different tests. And alignment studies are looking at how a score on a particular test aligns to the level of proficiency described by some kind of framework of language proficiency. So when we're talking about concordance, we're looking at, in this case, a concordance between PT academic and IELTS academic. You can run concordance across any comparable tests, so PTE and TOEFL, or language cert, something like that. And alignments are between a single test and a framework, so PTE academic and the Common European Framework of Reference or Canadian language benchmarks. And these frameworks try to describe language proficiency across different sort of levels or stages of development. So when we're looking at concordance studies, these are based on test score data, the actual data from real test takers who are taking both tests. And alignment studies are based in expert judgment. So we're using different kinds of information to determine these two things. We use expert judgment to understand how the items and performances in a particular test relate qualitatively to what the framework's actually describing at different points. In concordance, we're looking at actually just the test scores, not any real qualities of the performance, just looking at the scores and statistically how they compare to each other. So we do these in two different ways. Score concordance is looking at test takers who've taken both tests, comparing them in detail. And then we look at alignments by doing standard setting activities. So we have panels of language experts, they're rating test items and test taker performances and trying to find how they match up to what's described in a framework. And we use this to determine what scores mean in relation to a particular framework. I mention this because I think sometimes these two things get used interchangeably or sometimes confused, and it's a good idea to just take a step back and think about what are these two things, concordance studies and framework alignments, and what do they mean? And important to note for today, even though we've published a new concordance study with IELTS, this doesn't change our alignment to the CFR. PT Academic has the same alignment to the CFR, and it's something we've maintained through researching and developing the enhancements to the test. So let's dig into the study a little bit. How was it conducted? There are 5 main stages involved in a concordance study, and this is sort of generic for any concordance study that we conduct. You start by thinking about a construct comparison, and what that means is you need to be sure that the two tests that you're aiming to link in a concordance study are actually trying to measure the same thing so that it makes sense to compare them. Because it's possible to do sort of the statistical part of a concordance study with any two tests. I could try to link PT Academic to the Life in the UK test that's used for citizenship or the driving test and see what the relationship is between a score on one of those tests and a score on another. That might be interesting, but it's not a useful comparison because they're not trying to measure the same thing or be used for the same purposes. So the aim of a construct comparison is before you even start doing a concordance study to understand, does it make sense to try to link these two things together and try to find equivalent scores on the two different tests? So that's the first stage. And then we move on to a stage of data collection where participants sit both of the tests and they share official score reports with us. So this takes place over a number of months and you're trying to get test takers to take both of these tests in a really short period of time. And this forms the basis of the concordance analysis, all of the data you collect from these both of these two tests. We also do participant surveys. In some cases, at the end of the data collection, we also do one actually at the beginning of the data collection as well, which helps us determine who we want to invite to the study to make sure we're getting a really representative sample of people. And we also survey them at the end to see sort of the perceptions of the tests they've taken, how they prepared for them, and get a bit more qualitative information about the people who actually participated in the study, which helps us understand how relevant the study results are to just the general population of test takers. So you have all of your data, you're relatively happy that it's representing your intended demographics that you've gone out to recruit to, but you also need to pause and evaluate the sample and think about how representative all of the data you've collected actually is to live testing data that you have. So this is both in terms of the demographics of test takers, so their gender, nationality, language, but also statistically. So are the scores that you've collected in your concordance sample similar to the kinds of scores you see in live testing data? Is there a link between them? So once you've gone through this very lengthy period of collecting and evaluating your data, then you get to the point of your concordance analysis. There's a couple of different techniques you could use to do concordance analysis, but at this point is where you start to actually evaluate how these two scores relate to each other, scores on these two tests. And as I mentioned, there's lots of different ways you could conduct concordance studies, and for a long time, there was more diversity in the way that this happened. But in 2024, Knock and Fan published a very helpful piece of research that tried to sort of consolidate all of the best practice in concordance studies into a list of criteria that people conducting concordance studies should take into consideration. And this is the list. This table is actually included in our full report, so you can see each of those principles that they identified and exactly where in the report we have evidence related to those principles. So it's easy to see how we're trying to meet these criteria each step of the way. It's been very helpful to have a set of criteria that all people conducting concordance studies are trying to meet throughout the process. They're very ambitious criteria, so this is not an easy set of criteria to meet. I think anybody who's conducted a concordance study recently will note that this is a really challenging set of criteria. But we're happy to report that we were able to meet all of them across the board, and I hope you dig into the evidence of that as well. So as I mentioned, that first stage is looking at the construct comparison. How similar are PT academic and IELTS academic? Are they similar enough that it makes sense to actually try to find equivalent scores between them? So this is not something that Pearson conducted ourselves. We commissioned Dr. Safina Chan and Dr. Jonathan Jones at Crella, University of Bedfordshire, to conduct this construct comparison independently. So they went through all of the publicly available information about IELTS and all of the information we provided about the enhanced PT academic, including test specifications, sample test materials, some test taker performances, scoring rubrics, everything that we have related to this test, and evaluated how similar the underlying skills and tasks were to each other. So they used the sociocognitive framework to sort of build out the standard template for evaluating each of the item types, and they compare them in a great deal of depth. So this is a lengthy report, but it's a very useful one to understand. So what are the actual differences between the tests themselves, the items, how they're scored, and how those things compare? And their finding was that there are some differences between these tests. I think everyone on this webinar will be aware of some of those differences. But ultimately, there's actually a lot of similarity in what we're trying to do with both of these tests. There's a substantial amount of overlap, including the domains that we're targeting, the cognitive processes that test takers use in answering questions, and the kind of performance we're trying to measure across them. So their conclusion is that actually it does make sense to align these two score scales to each other. And aside from sort of the theoretical reasoning behind why it makes sense to align these score scales together, we also know that there are practical considerations. People just use both of these tests for the same purposes and in the same context, and it's imperative that they have information about the direct relationship between each other. So there's sort of a theoretical rationale behind why it makes sense or why it's okay to align the tests. But we also recognize that there is just a very real and practical need for people to have information about their alignment. So the study itself we recruited test takers in 4 different locations, and we managed to recruit a sample of just over 1,500 participants. And this is a really great result. I think this is the largest sample of any of the recent concordance studies published. It takes a huge amount of effort to recruit that number of people to participate in a concordance study. And that number actually doesn't reflect the total number of people who were enrolled in the study at one point in time. We actually recruited thousands of people to participate in the study. But one of the challenging aspects of running a concordance study is that you will have people who enroll in the study but don't finish all of the requirements or don't meet all of those criteria for the kind of data that we can include in the analysis. So this 1,522 number, that represents the total number of people that the final concordance analysis is based on. This is the full number who completed the study successfully and met all of the requirements involved. And one of the reasoning behind recruiting in 4 different locations was because we wanted to access a wide variety of test takers, not just in terms of demographics, but also in terms of levels of proficiency and at different points in their journey. So we worked with partners in India and China to locate test takers who were at the beginning of their either language learning journey or their journey to migrate to another country, and provide them with additional support to participate in the study. One of the challenges of concordance studies is it's difficult to collect data from test takers who are sort of earlier in their proficiency or at the beginning of their journey, because participating in a study can require some level of English language proficiency. So we knew from the start that we wanted to intentionally recruit people in this way and make sure they had all of the tools and support that they could to participate in the study with us. We also recruited test takers in the UK and many in Australia who'd already immigrated to their destination country and were living or working or studying there and had taken an English language test as part of that journey. So they were at sort of a more advanced level of proficiency, and were actually living in these environments where score requirements are being set. So it was a really nice distribution of test takers and a huge amount of effort to bring them on board. And in the end, our sample reflected 54 different nationalities and 43 different languages. So even though we were only recruiting from these 4 regions, we were able to get a really nice diversity of test takers that reflects the real population of PTE test takers around the world. We also were looking at the time between the 2 tests. So how long was it between the test, their IELTS or their PTE test, and the second test that they took? So you ideally want to minimize that distance between the 2 testing times so that you're getting the same snapshot of a test taker's performance. And best practice criteria recommend sort of a 90-day window. So tests should be taken within 90 days. And on average for us, we had about 18 days between tests, which is quite a short duration. And we even had 7 test takers who managed to take both tests on the same day, which is quite an interesting and impressive feat to me. One of the other things we look at is the order of testing. So you could take PTE first or IELTS first, and then take the other test after. So PTE first and then IELTS, or the other way around. And it's good practice to try to have a good balance between those 2 testing orders. And we managed to recruit a sample that had an exact balance over 1,000 people. And we also had some additional data from people who had taken IELTS first before enrolling in the study. So the the concordance report goes into some detail about how we monitored that balance to make sure we had the right balance and we were getting good concordance results at the end. And we also made sure that every single participant sent an official IELTS score report to us. So they sent a PDF version of their score report, and our research team manually checked that the details on that score report matched the details that we held for that test taker in our PT academic database. So we made sure that the 2 scores we were receiving from each participant were really from that person. And I should also mention, these were all taken in secure test centers, and the IELTS test that was taken is just the currently available IELTS academic test. The PTE tests that participants took were still in secure test centers. They went through the same testing experience, but they took the enhanced version of PTE. So this includes the 2 new item types that we'll be introducing, all of the new, the scoring criteria, new scoring rubrics. So they took the exact version of the enhanced PTE academic rather than the one that's currently in operation at this moment in time. We wanted to make sure that the concordance data we collected reflected all of the enhancements that will be live from August 7th. So this concordance becomes relevant sort of from August 7th onwards. So it was a large sample, and we also want to check that the sample we have collected is representative of real PTE test takers across a number of different dimensions. So in terms of gender, we're comparing the gender breakdown of our concordance sample to all PTE test takers in 2024. So you can see both the concordance study and the 2024 test population have about an even breakdown of gender. In terms of age, most of our test takers operationally are in their 20s. And the same was true of our concordance sample, but we did have representation of age groups from across the range. One thing I'll note is that the age group 16 to 20 is relevant in terms of the live testing population, but for our concordance study, we asked test takers to only participate if they were 18 or over to participate in sort of a research study. But we did sample from across the age range from 18 all the way to over 35. We also asked test takers about the reason for taking a language proficiency test, whether they were doing it for study or for migration. And we have about a similar split in the concordance study to what we find in the testing population. We noticed a slightly larger other category, this yellow category here for reason for testing in the concordance study. And part of that is because we included a free text response, so people wrote lots of reasons for why they were participating or why they were taking an English language test. Many of those could have been sorted into sort of a study or a migration pathway. And then some of them also included reasons like, I want to practice these English tests. So that was also represented within the study. We also wanted to look at the breakdown of the concordance sample along nationality and language and compare it to the live testing population. So I mentioned we had 54 nationalities, 43 different languages, so a really diverse range of test takers included in the study. But it's important for us to make sure that the top 5 nationalities and languages in our live testing population were also amply represented in the study. So you can see the percentage of test takers in 2024 from each of those categories compared to the percentage of the concordance sample in each of those categories. One thing you might notice is we had a few more Chinese test takers and Chinese Mandarin speakers who participated in the study than we had in the live testing population. And this is something we noticed really early on in recruiting our sample, that we had more people opt in to participate. We also noticed that these test takers were more likely to stay throughout the whole study and complete all of the requirements. So we started to introduce some additional recruitment to pick up particularly test takers in India and support them through participating in the concordance. And in the end, we still had about a fifth of our sample, over 20% of Indian test takers. So another important aspect of making sure your concordance data is useful and robust is looking at how familiar test takers are with the tests that they're taking as a part of the study. So we surveyed them both about their familiarity with the tests prior to participating in the study and also after participating in the study about how they prepared to take both tests. So we had about just over 600, so 663 people responded to the survey, so not the full sample. But everyone who did respond, the majority of them were already familiar with IELTS or PTE before participating in the study. This is largely because test takers who are willing to participate in a concordance study probably have taken one of these tests or are preparing for one of them at that point in time. But even so, we found that over 95% of our survey respondents reported that they prepared for the tests within the study as well. And that second set of graphs shows you the different methods that they used to prepare for the tests. So many of them use the free resources that are available online, either through the official website or through other free resources they could find. A small number of them also use paid resources, and these are likely people who were already engaged in preparation before joining the study. It's surprisingly, maybe not surprisingly, but an interestingly large number of people cited social media groups as a means of preparing for the test. So they're sharing information with other test takers and learning through sort of the collective wisdom of those groups. And then you'll notice on the PT academic side, there's a little lavender bar, and that represents the special offline practice test that we created for the Concordance study. So because we knew test takers were going to take this enhanced PTE with all of the updates to it, we wanted to make sure they had resources about the two new question types and knew what to expect from them and how to prepare so that they wouldn't be surprised when they got into the test center and they knew what was being asked of them. So overall, a pretty decent level of familiarity of test takers for both of these tests, and importantly, a willingness to engage in preparation to become familiar with both tests while participating in the study. So it's also important to look at how the data we collected in the Concordance study compares to the score data for both of these tests in live operation. So the Concordance study, I have on the screen here a table comparing mean scores from the most up-to-date publicly available information we have for IELTS, and then also our own information for PTE Academic in 2024. So comparing average scores for each of those two. And I'll just note the IELTS mean scores are only reported in terms of gender groups, so I've included both of those for the 2023-2024 data. And we also have the standard deviation of test scores. So standard deviation is a measure of how spread out data is, how spread out the score distribution is for each of those score types there. And this is one area where we do notice some differences between IELTS and PTE, and particularly around the productive skills. So you'll notice for speaking and writing that the relative standard deviation, which is just a measure of that standard deviation number in terms of the size of the score scale for the test. That's different between PTE and IELTS, and it's also different within IELTS between the receptive skills like listening and reading and the productive skills like speaking and writing. So all that this means is that the scores for speaking and writing tend to fall within a narrow range of the IELTS score scale. I think this is an important thing to highlight just in terms of transparency and helping people interpret concordance tables, to say that we see a slight difference in the way that the speaking and writing IELTS score skills are used. And this has kind of a knock-on effect on concordance for those skills when you're looking particularly at the really high or the really low end of the score distribution. So I'll come back to this in just a little bit more detail later, but I wanted to note that this is sort of one of the things that we found through this comparison. Of the concordance data set with the operational data set that actually does have some bearing on how we interpret concordance scores. So important to keep in mind. Also, in order to run a concordance, study, we have to know that there is actually some relationship between the scores on these two tests. So we can look at the correlation between the IELTS and PTE scores collected in our concordance sample. And we found a strong correlation, so 0.07 or 0.78 for overall scores, and sort of moderate to strong correlations across the 4 skill scores as well. So this gives us some indication that there is enough of a relationship between how people perform on these two tests to proceed with actually calculating our concordance tables. So you've collected all of the data. It's a representative data set. You're happy that it represents the the data that's available for the operational test, both in terms of scores achieved and demographics, and you have this large data set of test taker scores. How do you actually get to a concordance table from that? So we use equipercentile equating to link scores from PT academic to IELTS academic. And that term is probably something you've seen in pretty much every one of the recently published concordance studies. And I think it is worth taking a minute to just explain what we mean by equipercentile equating in like the most basic terms possible. So the idea behind equipercentile equating is a method that tries to identify equivalent score points in the two tests by aligning the percentiles on them. So I've included an example here. It's a very simplified example that's really just I've made in PowerPoint to illustrate the example. This isn't the exact data from the concordance study. But what we see, the idea behind equipercentile equating is that you'll look at a score point on the scale. And these lines here represent the cumulative scores frequency for each of the two tests. So you're seeing the percentage of people, the percentile for each of those scores. So in very simple terms, you look at, for a score on the PTE scale, you figure out what percentile that is. You look at the same percentile on the IELTS score distribution, and you see what score that is. And that's what we mean by equipercentile equating. We're trying to find these equivalent scores by locating them in the score distributions. There's a bit more technical detail behind this. It's available in the full report. So if you're interested in sort of the details of how concordance tables come to be, I think it's worth reading about them. But I just wanted to make sure everybody's on the same page about what we actually mean when we say calculated the concordance, and particularly if you've seen this term equipercentile equating and kind of wondered what we meant by that. Right, so this is all sort of the analysis that goes on behind the scenes, and now we get to the point where we have concordance tables to share and results to share with everybody. So what are we actually sharing? The two things that come out of this concordance study, the first is we have updates to the overall score concordance. So the concordance between PTE academic and IELTS academic overall scores. We've published that concordance at different points in time. So the original concordance for PT academic was run back in 2007 during the field testing for PT academic. And then in 2019, we started running a new concordance study to sort of check in on the concordance and see if it had changed over time. So we also published that in 2020 as an updated overall score concordance study between the two tests. And so now in 2025, we're publishing an update to that again. And in the next few slides, I'll show you how they compare across those three different studies that we have for overall score concordance. One of the new things you'll also see in this report is that we're publishing skill score concordance. So how the skill scores compare between the two tests. This individual skill score concordance between, for example, PTE listening and IELTS listening. That's not something that we've published before, so that's new data for us to share. Whereas the overall score concordance, we do have previous research that we can compare to. Let's take a look at the overall score concordance updates. This is the table, sort of a simplified table that shows the alignment between PT academic and IELTS academic overall scores. So you can see the range of score points on PT academic that relate to the bands for IELTS academic. And I think sometimes tables can be a bit abstract to look at. So I prefer to visualize it sort of as a line graph. And what you see here is, let's get a laser pointer. So these points represent the lowest point in that PTE range of scores that relates to an IELTS band. And then you can see the range of PTE scores up until the next point, the next threshold for an IELTS band. So this shows you sort of visually how those scores are relating to each other. And we can compare this to how the previous study's overall score concordance looked. So I'll add the lines for those earlier studies onto the graph. You can see the 2007 study is in the dark purple line, The 2020 study is in a light blue line, and then we still have 2025 in this light pink line. And you can see sort of how they relate to each other. I think one interesting thing to note about these is that there's actually quite a lot of consistency. When you think about these are 3 studies run over almost a 20-year period with completely different groups of test takers. And in 2007, a different methodology for calculating concordance. And we see a lot of consistency in the ranges and the thresholds that we find. So I think this was a really nice finding for us to see that there has been some stability and overall score concordance hasn't changed meaningfully. In most cases, you can see this pink line falls right in between the blue and purple lines. So this 2025 overall score concordance is just somewhere mostly in between the two of them. So we can also take a look at our skill score concordance. And this is the same table I've just shown, just sort of vertically. So PTE and IELTS overall. And until this study, this was all that we typically published for concordance. But now we're adding a separate skill concordance for listening, reading, speaking, and for writing. And this is a lot of numbers on a table I can see, so I'll just sort of pause here for a moment. People can take a look at the different ranges. And I'll just highlight a couple of things that you might notice straight away. The first is that listening and reading have really similar ranges. So these are considered our receptive skills, and our score concordance values across them are very similar and identical at some points. And they're a little bit different to speaking and writing scores. You'll notice speaking and writing have a different relationship to IELTS than listening and reading do. And if you remember back to the slide where I was talking about sort of standard deviation and the spread of scores, this is where we can see that feeding through into concordance. So because we see the IELTS scores for speaking and writing falling into sort of a narrower range of their score scale, we have to fit all of our concordance values into that narrow range as well. So it's all just a bit compressed. So that means we see some lower scores for speaking, writing at the lower end of the range compared to listening and reading, and then the opposite at the top end. So a bit higher for speaking and writing compared to listening and reading. So it's important to say that these differences reflect the differences that we see in the actual scores themselves, right? So where we see differences between IELTS listening and reading score distribution compared to speaking and writing, that's what we can also see in the concordance tables. So what does this all mean for institutions and setting score requirements? I'm sure you're all thinking this is a very nice study. It's great to hear the details about it, but what do we do with this information? How do people consume it or figure out how to use it in a way that makes sense for them? So I think one thing to keep in mind is that it's always good practice to review your score requirements. That's always been true. It's something Pearson's always supported as well. I think we're very interested in making sure that different test score users set requirements that are right for them, that meet their needs. So there's a couple things to keep in mind when you're doing that. Concordance is certainly part of that equation. It's part of that picture of figuring out where requirements should be. But important to remember that concordance is always approximate. It's a very helpful tool, but it's just one tool to understanding what score requirements should be. So even the highest quality concordance, you can meet every single one of the best practice criteria. You can collect a massive sample of data and go through really robust statistical analyses to get to your concordance tables. But at the end, you always have an approximate relationship between tests. And that's because they are essentially 2 different tests with 2 different score scales and different item types. So this concordance gives you an estimation or approximation of how the scores lined up with the most sort of scientific and robust evidence that we can put behind it. But concordance can only ever be really an approximate relationship, even in the best circumstances. Score scales impact concordance. So sort of what I mentioned, the difference between receptive or productive skill, score scale use, but also the size of the categories in your score scale. PT Academic has a really granular score scale, and I think this is a huge strength in the context of setting score requirements. You can choose where you want to set scores within a range. You don't have to accept sort of very blunt cutoffs. We know that that large ranges of performance can be found in score categories. For example, within a particular IELTS band, you'll see a gradation of performance from somebody who's just within that band all the way to someone who's secure, all the way up to someone who's just about to reach into the score above. And one of the benefits of PTE is we have scores at different points along that scale. So it's possible to sort of decide within that range what an appropriate score requirement might be. Gives you more information about the different levels of performance you might see across the whole population of test takers. Another thing to keep in mind is that really, when we're setting score requirements, what we want to know is a performance standard, right? Score requirements are there because we're looking for people who are able to demonstrate a certain level of ability. So what they know and they're able to do when they're actually communicating in the real world. That's what actually matters about score requirements. So important to keep that in mind. Concordance studies give us statistical information about how test scores line up with each other and the percentage of people achieving them, but they aren't really information about performance standards. So if you're interested in performance standards, it's important to think about things like alignments to other frameworks, exemplar performances, and I'll show you a few examples of these next. But important to think about what actually your score requirement represents to you if you're an institution. What are you actually hoping to see in different candidates and the level of ability they're able to demonstrate? That's the main consideration when we're looking to set score requirements. So as I mentioned, framework alignments, I'll just remind us, this is the alignment between PT Academic and the Common European Framework of Reference. This has always been the alignment for PTE, and it always will be. So throughout the range of evidence that we considered and research developing test enhancements, this was really a guiding force for us. We wanted to never change the outward meaning of our test scores. So everything that we do in calibrating the test and sort of modifying anything within scoring requirements, all of that is done in service of keeping this alignment the same. So a B1 is a 43, and it has been and will be. This particular CFR table also shows these dotted lines just below the level of each CFR threshold. And that's to indicate that in the real world, nobody is just A2 one day, they wake up the next morning and they're B1, right? Proficiency is a spectrum and is evolving, and it's not always linear. But these scores here sort of represent the beginnings of B1 proficiency. People are starting to be able to answer B1 tasks, and they're beginning to move into that next level above them. So again, one of the nice things about a granular score scale is you can sort of see that transition moment and find people within that transition moment as well. But just to reiterate, this is the same. This hasn't changed based on concordance at all. This is based on standard setting activities. And one thing that we know can be confusing about understanding concordance studies and what their results mean is that each test has its own independent alignment to the CFR. And those alignments don't always match up with what we find in concordance studies. So for example, IELTS reports that a 6 is equivalent to a B2. There's a line to a B2. But when we look at the equivalent score range from this concordance study, we see those scores as B1. And similarly at 6.5, IELTS reports an alignment to B2, and we see this equivalent score range on PTE as sort of that transition point between B1 and B2. IELTS 7, similarly, we're seeing that IELTS reports an alignment to C1, and we're seeing, we would align our scores in that range to B2. And I mention this because these are important, sort of a range that people use to set score requirements. And it's important to think about sort of what the relationship is between different alignments and test scores. I think this finding is also consistent with the other concordance studies that we've seen come out recently, and even the IELTS TOEFL joint concordance study, where IELTS academic scores are reported in alignment to a particular CFR level, but the equivalent scores on TOEFL would be aligned to a different CFR level at some points on the scale. I think this is an area that deserves a lot more research, and I think it's something we're definitely interested in understanding more the phenomenon that we're seeing, because we see it in a couple of different independent studies as well. And I understand that this is also frustrating for score users if we're trying to understand what scores mean when we get different sort of information from different types of evidence. But I think one reason that this happens is people have different methods of conducting alignments. Where I showed you sort of the best practice criteria that we have for concordance studies, we don't have the same level of detail in terms of best practice criteria for alignment activities. There's a manual for aligning tests, and we all refer to it, but it's sort of a more broad suggestion of different methods that could work rather than the prescriptive kind of best practice criteria that we have for concordance. So it's an interesting phenomenon to see there are some differences in the way these things stack up against each other. And because we know that for me as a researcher, that might be an interesting phenomenon, but for test score users, this is a source of frustration and confusion when setting score requirements. One of the things that we've tried to do when launching the enhancements is provide additional support. And this is something I'm always willing to talk to institutions about, helping people find the right score requirements for their purposes. One of the ways that we're doing that is by launching sort of an expanded set of performance exemplars that demonstrate the qualities of speaking and writing proficiency at different points along our score scale. So we've broken them out into CFR groups, so B1, B2, and C1. And we also include examples from low, mid, and high score ranges within those CFR categories. You can see this is the list of videos available on the website that exemplify these performance standards. Writing is grouped into a single video for B1, but B2 and C1, it still includes the low, mid, and high exemplars. It's all just one video. And speaking, these videos are a bit longer, so we've broken them out into separate videos for each of those categories. But the writing videos show examples of the write essay, so our longest piece of extended written text that test takers produce, along with commentary about why this particular test taker is demonstrating qualities at that particular CFR level. For speaking, we have included 4 item type responses from each test taker. So these are, again, our longest speaking items, the longest spoken samples that you can see. That includes describe image, retell lecture, summarize group discussion. So the 2 new item types summarize group discussion and respond to a situation. And I will play one of these. I hope that my audio works, but if it doesn't, I've included a link at the end to take you to where these are on the website. Just skip to a later point where you can see a response. I'll just pause there. I'm not sure if you could hear that, but if not, I do have the link available later. Just to illustrate what we're trying to do with these exemplars. I know that performance exemplars are things that we've produced over time. Other testing organizations do, but specifically with this set of them, we've tried to include more granular information. So examples at low, medium, and high performance within a CFR level, and also multiple test takers within each of those categories. So you'll see 2 to 3 test taker performances at, for example, B2 low, 2 to 3 at B2 mid. And this is to really illustrate that every test taker is different. The way that they arrive at a score can be slightly different. And when we're setting score requirements, it's important to keep that in mind, that there's variation among test takers. And what we really want to do is get a feeling for what kind of proficiency is demonstrated at different score points and what that means in real terms, like tangibly, realistically, what can you expect to see from different score points along the score scale. Right, so let's revisit our original questions and talk about some of our key takeaways. Why is score concordance important? What exactly is it? I hope this has helped shed some light on that. It's score concordance aims to align scores on different tests, and we do that by following some very structured best practice principles, but it's always an approximate relationship. Even as an approximate relationship, it really can be a helpful way to think about where score requirements should be set, but it's not really the definitive way to set score requirements. It's just one piece of information that can help inform that decision. This particular study has been the most comprehensive, up-to-date, exhaustive study of PT academic, IELTS academic score relationship, and particularly based on this enhanced test launching from August 7th. So this is the most up-to-date and relevant information that you can use for PT academic, IELTS academic score relationships. We also have introduced here an updated overall concordance, but as I've shown, it's really largely consistent with our previous concordance studies. What is new is we're introducing score concordance information, and I hope it's been useful to sort of talk through what we see in those skill score tables and explain a little bit of what we're seeing there. And what does this mean for institutions and other people who set score requirements? And again, as I've said, we really do support people in setting the right score requirements for their needs and revisiting them to make sure that they're still serving those needs. We're very committed to submitting or providing a range of information that can support those decisions. I think this score concordance study is an important part of that. It is very helpful information, but we have more information that we can provide as well. And we're very happy to work with institutions to help them make sense of different kinds of information and help them land on score requirements that are right for them. So just to note, this concordance study is one of 4 publications that we've put out in the last week. So we have a report on the enhanced PT academic that goes into a bit of detail about the research and reasoning behind some of the enhancements in the test. We have the construct comparison that looks at what IELTS and PTE assess in some detail and understanding whether or not they're similar enough to compare. We have this concordance report. We also have a summary version of this concordance report if you're looking to read sort of a shorter version that contains just the important information. And we have a paper on test taker perspectives. So this is something we've investigated through every step of the way in developing enhancements and conducting score concordance, making sure that test takers' views were represented and taken into account in everything that we were doing. All right, so I think I'll pause there. I'm sure we have some questions in the chat. Just to note that these 2 links on screen, these are the links that take you to the PTE research page where you can find those research papers. And then those exemplar videos that I showed, those can be found on the score setting guidance for institutions page. Gives you a lot of detail about other considerations, how you think about concordance in relation to other considerations in terms of setting score requirements. So thanks very much for joining me this morning. I think we have Sophie with us who may have seen some questions coming in and might be able to let me know.
Yeah, we have a couple. So we have somebody's asked a couple of questions. I'm just trying to get my head around how to word it properly. So I don't know if you've got the chat in front of you as well. But one is about what buffers should be made when making decisions, especially near the thresholds. So if it's plus 2 points at a score of 65, so for when people are setting their cut-off scores, what kind of buffer would you recommend for margins of error?
That's a good question. Yep, I can see the Q&A now. So the idea of standard error. So we have a table in the full study. I think it's I can't remember which appendix actually off the top of my head, but there's an appendix that includes all of our the most recent standard error of measurement information for the enhanced test. So this is based on our field testing and concordance study combined. The overall across the board is about 3 points, and that's the same as it really has been for PTE since it launched in the beginning. So that's typically kind of the standard error of measurement that we're looking at for PTE. Hasn't changed, but if you want to look at really specific values, that appendix is there in the paper.
Brilliant. And the second part of that question was regarding the marking of speaking and writing. And because it's auto marked, how is the oversight of that when it's not a human marker? What sort of checks are done?
Yes. So it depends on question types. So all of our extended response questions where I think you're looking at standardization. So I'm assuming you're talking about specifically things scored with scoring rubrics that have lots of different levels to them. So we start every part of the scoring journey by having human score responses against those scoring criteria. And we check that those humans are scoring responses in a way that they agree with each other and that they're using all the score categories across the score scale, that we have really good human data about how those items should be scored. We use that data to train the automated scoring engines. And then we check that the automated scoring engine is predicting human scores accurately. And then for all of the extended response questions, so there's 7 item types in total in the test from August 7th, we'll have an additional human check on content for all the speaking items. And then for the essay, an additional human check on development structure, coherence, and general linguistic range. So these are the traits that we have sort of human in the loop checking happening in real time. But we have humans really involved in every part of an AI scored test. I think sometimes people think it's sort of we just set it and forget it. That's not what happens. We check constantly that we're still scoring things accurately, and we have various points of human review along the way.
Brilliant. Then the next question is explaining a bit more about the 2 updated questions for PT speaking.
Yes, we have lots of resources on the website. And Sophie, you probably know more than I do about exactly the resources we have available on the website. But I know we've recently run a webinar that goes into some detail on this, and Jared is putting up some videos to support test takers. Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got item type videos. We have Gerard explaining the 2 question types as well. And then we also will have the recordings of our test taker webinar that we ran, so that I will put the link in the follow-up email for people to go and have a look and dig into the question types in a bit more detail. There's lots of prep support on there as well.
Yeah.
The next one is about a call. I'm trying, you probably understand this one better than I do. It's about the confusing cases when the concordant alignment tables and the ranges within them don't agree with the stipulated requirements of visas, for example, who are going for low score requirements to be more competitive.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because, I mean, the one thing that we don't do as PTE is set any score requirements. So all we can do is try to provide information to people outwardly who are setting score requirements to help them set the score requirements that fit for them and that are fair across different tests. So I agree, it is frustrating when you've got things that don't quite add up across different types of research. But it's something we're working on. And I'm actually really interested if people have suggestions about things they want to know or research you'd like to see from us that can help institutions and governments make better informed decisions, because it's something we're thinking about all the time and definitely a focus of our research agenda going forward.
Thank you. And then the final question is on why was it important to separate the results by gender?
Oh, good question. So it's really to check that the data we collected in the concordance sample is representative of the data that we collect or we see in the live testing population. We would never use sort of different concordance tables for genders. I don't want you to assume that. It's really just to see that the data that we've got matches up with actually our real test takers. And gender is one of the facets that we have information about. So we have gender, language, age group, nationality, languages spoken. And really what we do is just check that across all of those different facets, the data we've collected seems to be representative of everyone taking the test globally for PTE.